For a lot of us, the emotion of guilt can be very sticky. We can carry around the sense that we could have done better in the past. We have somehow failed, we let someone down, we disappointed ourselves. But at the heart of this feeling, there's of course this belief that we are this entity which, when transported back into time, could have done better. So there are a lot of assumptions we make about what we are, what this universe is, and what time is. So if we want to overcome these feelings of guilt, it's worth looking into these core assumptions we have about ourselves. When we say that we are guilty, then we have this very basic sense that we are this chooser, this performer of actions, which is somehow standing separate from the world. We are somehow this entity which is moving through the universe and has this free will to make different choices. And of course, if this is the sense we have about what we are, then every decision we make is likely to trigger some sense of guilt. Because we always have this idea that we could have made a better choice, right? And so a very radical answer to these kinds of feelings of guilt would be to say that you never existed as this separate entity. What you are, what you really are, is just the suchness of experience right now. And this suchness doesn't consist of separately existing objects and beings. It exists in a way that is utterly mysterious and ungraspable. It is totally transcendental. And for this reason, because we cannot even speak of actually existing entities and an actually existing separate self who can somehow make choices, it doesn't even make sense to speak of guilt. If there is just the suchness of pure existence, there is no context in which we could speak of guilt. There's just reality being itself. Now, that kind of insight shouldn't just be a cognitive belief that we take on, a kind of feel-good story of our experience. What I was just speaking about can actually be noticed, realized about this very experience you're having right now. And if you want this kind of liberation of what I was just speaking about, then simply notice that in your experience. Notice how this entire field of experience is utterly transcendental. You cannot say what anything is. You cannot pin down any part of your experience. You will just arrive at this total alive emptiness of being. It's absolutely present as all of these shapes and colors and this movement, this flow. But if you try to find what anything is, you can't do it. It is simply empty of an inherent nature which you could somehow grasp and define. And this insight is absolutely real. It's there to be had. But you might have the sense that this is somehow not satisfying. Because yes, in an absolute sense, that might be true. But what about this life of the human being who still has to make choices? Who wants to live a good life? Who doesn't want to make bad choices? We need to acknowledge this aspect of reality as well. We can't just afford to throw that out of the window, tempting as it may be. Because it's not the case that this transcendental view, which I was just speaking about, is the only view we have on life. It's very much the case that we still experience this transcendental reality as these separately existing objects and beings. We just don't take them to be true, to be that way fundamentally. But we still respect the fact that it appears this way. So this is conventional reality. This is the reality in which we live our human life. So how do we integrate this realization of the absolute, of the fact that we can't even speak of anything as separately existing, into our conventional experience of life? That is, in a sense, the challenge of spiritual life. How do we embody this realization? The way to embody this absolute reality is not to just hand wave all responsibility and say, oh, it was just being itself, it was just the universe doing its own thing, I have no guilt whatsoever. We will find that this is not really a wise, integrated, embodied way of living. This is just adopting a kind of cognitive interpretation of this transcendental realization and attaching ourselves to that. I find that an actual embodiment of this realization is much more wise, integrated, and dynamic. It respects the relative circumstances of life, but it does so without this reinforcement, this false belief in being a separately existing entity. So what does that mean very concretely? When we mess up, when we make a mistake, there isn't this huge construct of an identity which now has to respond to the situation. There isn't the sense that we have somehow ultimately failed and we could have done better. The way I experience it is that there is more so an openness, a wisdom which naturally arises, which takes the situation on as it is and learns from it. Our true nature, we could say, functions as a kind of supercomputer who takes into account all the factors that went into this seemingly wrong decision and can learn from it. It can grow in wisdom in a relative sense. And so what for us seems like something we should be guilty about is, from the viewpoint of our true nature, just an opportunity to grow and evolve, to gain in wisdom, to become a more full embodiment, a more full expression of this transcendental reality in our conventional world. And so when we do mess up, there's more so the sense that this is something we can learn from. This is not something we should feel guilty about that makes us fundamentally flawed. No, this was just the response that was made based on the conditioning that was present. And this kind of conditioning, right, if it led to a seemingly wrong decision, just is what it is in any given instance. This kind of neurotic patterning, which was maybe ingrained in us for a very long time, is gradually released, gradually freed from the system, cleaned out, so to say. And so there's nothing to feel guilty about there, right? This is just the process of unfolding, we could say. And so true nature, in a more conventional sense, shows up as this welcoming, accepting space which takes on your decisions, allows them to happen, but doesn't condemn you for them, doesn't judge you for them. It takes on all the factors that were in play there, learns from them, and therefore informs the next decision, the next action that is performed, to be, in a relative sense, more in line with our true nature. And that doesn't, of course, necessarily mean that we will never feel bad for having made some kind of suboptimal decision. But it's much different if this kind of bad feeling is not reinforced by this neurotic sense of being a separately existing self, when this whole identity construct isn't there to latch onto this bad decision and judge ourselves for it. From the view of our true nature, that doesn't make much sense. So it happens less and less and less, I would say. And over time, these kinds of excessive feelings of guilt just get cleared out of the system.